The crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the mahogany tables of Meridian, the city's most exclusive restaurant. David Chun moved between the tables with practiced grace, his black vest and bow tie immaculate despite the demanding evening shift. At table 7, three men in expensive suits leaned forward in intense conversation, their voices carrying the weight of serious business. Marcus Sterling, recognizable from countless magazine covers, gestured broadly with his wine glass. His platinum watch caught the light as he spoke loudly enough for nearby diners to hear. The two Japanese businessmen across from him maintained polite expressions, though David noticed their subtle signs of discomfort. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their job? David approached with the second course, setting each plate with quiet precision. Sterling barely acknowledged him, continuing his boisterous pitch about revolutionary technology and massive profit margins. The older Japanese gentleman, distinguished with silver hair and kind eyes, offered David a respectful nod of thanks. As David stepped back, he caught fragments of Sterling's presentation. The billionaire was making cultural missteps that would be obvious to anyone familiar with Japanese business customs. David's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional composure, clearing the adjacent table while the crucial negotiation continued to deteriorate. The modest apartment felt worlds away from Meridian's opulent dining room. David hung his server's vest in the cramped closet, his shoulders aching from another 12-hour shift. The living room walls displayed an unexpected collection of Japanese woodblock prints and calligraphy scrolls, carefully framed despite their humble surroundings. Emma looked up from her homework spread across the kitchen table, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. At 8 years old, she possessed a wisdom that often surprised adults, a trait born from being raised by a single father who treated her as his equal partner in navigating life's challenges. "Dad, I'm stuck on this geography question about Tokyo," she said, pointing to her textbook with a pencil worn down to the eraser. David settled beside her, studying the page. "Tokyo sits on Honshu Island," he explained gently, then added in fluid Japanese, "Neon no Ichiban Uki Toshi Desu." It's Japan's largest city. Emma's eyes widened with delight. "You always know the coolest things, Dad. Will we ever go there?" David's expression softened as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Someday, sweetheart, when things get better for us." The apartment held traces of a different life scattered among their simple furnishings. Business books in multiple languages lined a small shelf, and a framed photograph showed David in a sharp suit shaking hands with important-looking men in what appeared to be a corporate boardroom, though Emma had never asked about that picture. Back at Meridian the following evening, the atmosphere at Table 7 had grown noticeably tense. David refilled water glasses as Sterling launched into another aggressive sales pitch, his voice cutting through the restaurant's refined ambience like a buzzsaw through silk. "Listen, gentlemen," Sterling declared, jabbing his finger at the contract spread before them. "This deal is worth billions. Time is money, and I don't believe in wasting either with endless ceremony." The older Japanese businessman, Kenji Yamamoto, exchanged a subtle glance with his younger colleague. David recognized the micro-expression of polite disapproval that would be invisible to most Westerners but spoke volumes in Japanese business culture. Sterling continued his presentation, completely oblivious to the cultural damage he was inflicting. He interrupted his guests repeatedly, dismissed their thoughtful questions with impatient waves, and made no effort to understand the careful protocol that governs such important negotiations. David watched the younger Japanese executive shift uncomfortably in his chair. The man's business card lay untouched on the table, where Sterling had carelessly tossed it instead of receiving it with the proper two-handed respect it deserved. Yamamoto-san's expression remained perfectly composed, but David could see the decision forming behind his weathered eyes. The billionaire's arrogance was systematically destroying what should have been a mutually beneficial partnership, and Sterling remained completely unaware of his mounting failures. Sterling's frustration mounted as the evening progressed. The Japanese executives had grown increasingly quiet, their polite responses becoming shorter and more formal. Even someone with Sterling's limited emotional intelligence could sense the deal slipping away, though he blamed their reserved nature rather than his own behavior. As David approached to clear the appetizer plates, Sterling's desperation manifested as cruel humor. He grabbed David's wrist as the waiter reached for his plate, causing a momentary silence at the table. "You know what?" Sterling announced loudly, his voice carrying to nearby tables. "Maybe we need some local help here." He gestured dismissively at David. "Hey, waiter boy, you wouldn't happen to speak any Japanese, would you?" The question dripped with sarcasm and condescension. Sterling's laugh was harsh and artificial as he looked between his guests and David, clearly expecting to humiliate the server while somehow impressing the businessman with his crude attempt at humor. David felt the familiar weight of invisible chains, the same feeling he'd carried for months as he'd hidden his true capabilities behind the safety of anonymity. The Japanese executives looked mortified by Sterling's behavior, their discomfort palpable in the suddenly thick air. Yamamoto-san's eyes met David's for a brief moment, and the older man's expression conveyed both apology for Sterling's rudeness and genuine curiosity about how this dignified young man would respond to such public humiliation. David stood frozen, the empty plates balanced in his hands as Sterling's mocking laughter echoed through the dining room. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat into the kitchen's safety, to maintain the protective anonymity that had shielded him and Emma from the complications of his former life. What's a skill you have that people might be surprised to learn about? Share in the comments. But something in Yamamoto-san's kind eyes stirred a memory of who David used to be, when respect and dignity weren't luxuries he couldn't afford. The older businessman's gentle expression held no judgment, only patient waiting to see what this young man would choose. Sterling continued his cruel performance, turning to his guests with exaggerated gestures. "See what I mean about the help around here? Can't even answer a simple question." The younger Japanese executive winced visibly at the word help, and David saw his own father's face in that moment of cultural pain. His father, who had taught him that all honest work deserved respect, that a man's character wasn't measured by his title, but by how he treated others. David set the plates down carefully on a nearby service station, his movements deliberate and calm. When he turned back to the table, something had shifted in his posture. The invisible weight seemed to lift from his shoulders as he made his choice. "Sterling-san," David said quietly, his voice carrying a new authority that made the billionaire's smirk falter slightly. The single word hung in the air like a bell's resonance. Sterling's expression shifted from amusement to confusion as he processed the respectful honorific that had just emerged from his waiter's lips with perfect pronunciation. David turned to face Yamamoto-san directly, bowing with the precise angle reserved for respected business equals. When he spoke again, his Japanese flowed like water, each syllable crisp and culturally appropriate. "Yamamoto-san, sumamasen ga kono kata no taido wa totemo shitsuri desu." Please forgive this man's disrespectful behavior toward honored guests in our establishment. The effect was immediate and electric. Both Japanese businessmen straightened in their chairs, their eyes widening with genuine surprise. Yamamoto-san's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile of the evening as he recognized not just fluent Japanese, but the sophisticated business dialect used in high-level negotiations. The younger executive leaned forward, his earlier discomfort replaced by intense curiosity. He addressed David in rapid Japanese, testing the depth of his knowledge with complex business terminology. David responded effortlessly, his answers revealing an intimate understanding of Japanese corporate culture, international trade protocols, and the specific industry challenges these men faced. Sterling sat frozen, his wine glass halfway to his lips, as the conversation he couldn't understand swirled around him with increasing animation and respect. Yamamoto-san set down his teacup with deliberate care, his experienced eyes studying David with newfound recognition. The conversation had evolved beyond pleasantries into sophisticated discussion of market dynamics and cultural integration strategies that few Westerners could navigate with such nuance. Your understanding of Ki philosophy is quite remarkable, Yamamoto-san said in English, switching languages to include Sterling in what was about to unfold. Tell me, young man, where did you acquire such deep knowledge of Japanese business culture? David glanced briefly at Sterling, whose face had drained of color as the reality of his situation crystallized. I spent several years facilitating international partnerships between American and Japanese corporations, David replied with quiet dignity, before my current circumstances required a change in career path. The younger executive pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Within moments, his expression changed to one of recognition and respect. Yamamoto-san, he whispered in Japanese, this is David Chun. He was the lead consultant on the Nakamura Industries' expansion into Silicon Valley 3 years ago. Sterling's wine glass trembled in his grip as he watched his billion-dollar deal evaporate before his eyes. The two men he'd been condescending to all evening were now engaged in animated discussion with his waiter about market penetration strategies and cultural sensitivity protocols that Sterling had never bothered to learn, despite his wealth and supposed business acumen. The memory swept over David like a tide as Yamamoto-san's respectful questions drew out the story he'd buried beneath months of quiet servitude. 3 years ago, he had stood in boardrooms commanding respect, his expertise bridging cultural gaps that others couldn't navigate. My wife became ill, David explained simply, his voice steady despite the weight of those words. The medical expenses required choices I never imagined making. When she passed, I found myself responsible for our daughter and debts that made returning to consulting impossible. Yamamoto-san nodded with deep understanding, recognizing the honor in David's sacrifice. In our culture, we deeply respect those who place family above personal ambition. Your devotion speaks to your character. Sterling shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling as the conversation revealed depths of experience and wisdom that his wealth couldn't purchase. David's calm dignity in explaining his circumstances stood in stark contrast to Sterling's crude displays of power. The younger executive leaned forward with genuine curiosity. The Nakamura project was legendary in our circles. You solved integration challenges that had stumped teams of specialists. David's slight smile held both pride and melancholy. Sometimes the most complex problems require simple solutions rooted in mutual respect and cultural understanding, something many brilliant people overlook in their rush toward profit. The shift in power dynamics became unmistakable as Yamamoto-san turned his chair to face David directly, effectively excluding Sterling from the conversation. The younger executive followed suit, pulling out a leather portfolio and setting it between them on the table. Chun-san, Yamamoto-san said with formal respect, we have been seeking the right partner for our North American expansion. Someone who understands both cultures deeply, not merely someone with capital. Sterling's face flushed red as he realized that Japanese businessmen were conducting serious negotiations with his waiter while he sat ignored at his own table. His hands clenched into fists as years of assumed superiority crumbled around him. David listened thoughtfully as the executives outlined their vision for sustainable technology partnerships, their words painting pictures of innovation guided by wisdom rather than greed. The conversation flowed in 2 languages, with David seamlessly translating cultural nuances that Sterling couldn't begin to comprehend. What about your current obligations? The younger executive asked, gesturing subtly towards Sterling, who had grown increasingly agitated. David's voice remained steady and professional. My primary obligation is to my daughter and providing stability for her future. Any partnership would need to honor those priorities. Sterling slammed his wine glass down, the sound sharp enough to turn heads throughout the restaurant. This is ridiculous, he sputtered, his composure finally shattering completely. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Yamamoto-san reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing an elegant business card holder. He presented his card to David with both hands, the gesture carrying the weight of formal business respect that he had never shown Sterling despite the billionaire's desperate attempts to impress. "We would be honored to discuss a consulting arrangement that respects your family commitments," Yamamoto-san said quietly. "Remote work, flexible schedule, compensation that reflects your true value." David accepted the card with appropriate ceremony, studying it carefully before responding. The younger executive smiled at David's perfect adherence to protocol, a stark contrast to Sterling's earlier dismissive treatment of their cards. Sterling's chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as he stood abruptly, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You people are making a huge mistake," he declared, his voice shaking with fury. "This man is nobody. A waiter. A servant." The restaurant fell silent as other diners turned to stare at the commotion. David remained seated, his posture calm and dignified despite Sterling's public outburst. His hands rested peacefully on the table, showing none of the tension that roiled through the air around them. Yamamoto-san rose slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes never left Sterling's face as he spoke with quiet authority that cut through the billionaire's bluster like a blade through paper. Yamamoto-san's voice carried the authority of decades in international business as he addressed Sterling with ice-cold precision. "In Japan, we have a saying, the tree that bears the most fruit bows the lowest. You, Sterling-san, have shown us only empty branches reaching desperately toward the sky." The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence as the elderly businessman continued his measured judgment. "This young man demonstrates more wisdom in his humility than you have shown in all your wealth. Character cannot be purchased, dignity cannot be manufactured, and respect must be earned." Sterling's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his usual arsenal of threats and bluster useless against such calm, devastating truth. The younger executive gathered their materials with quiet efficiency, his actions speaking louder than any words of dismissal. "We came here seeking a partner, not a master," Yamamoto-san continued. "Davidson understands what you cannot learn. True success comes from lifting others, not stepping on them. His circumstances do not diminish his worth, they reveal it." David remained seated throughout the confrontation, his expression compassionate even toward Sterling despite the billionaire's earlier cruelty. This restraint only amplified the contrast between the two men's characters. Sterling stumbled backward, his billion-dollar deal evaporating like smoke. The respect and partnership he had tried to buy with arrogance now flowed freely toward a man who had earned it through quiet dignity and genuine competence. 3 months later, David sat in his small apartment's transformed spare room, now equipped with the latest video conferencing technology. On his screen, the faces of Yamamoto-san and his team smiled warmly as they concluded another successful strategy session. The consulting arrangement had exceeded everyone's expectations, allowing David to work from home while earning more than his previous corporate salary. Emma burst through the door, waving a colorful brochure with excitement. "Dad, look what came in the mail. The tickets for our trip to Japan." David's heart swelled as he watched his daughter's joy. The business partnership had flourished beyond mere profit into genuine friendship, and Yamamoto-san had personally invited them to visit Tokyo as honored guests of his company. Through the window, David could see Meridian's glowing sign across the street. He'd returned once to thank the manager who had given him steady work during their darkest months. The man had listened in amazement as David explained his new circumstances, offering him a standing invitation to dine there as a guest rather than an employee. Sterling's name occasionally appeared in business headlines, but David felt no satisfaction in the billionaire's subsequent struggles. True success wasn't about others falling, but about rising together. Emma climbed onto his lap, studying the Japanese characters on their travel documents. "Will you teach me more words before we go?" David smiled, wrapping his arms around his daughter. "Of course, sweetheart. We have so much to learn from each other."